In the early hours of the 17th of July 1918, a telegram reached the private secretary of King George V, informing him that his first cousin, the former Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, had been shot in a cellar in the Ural mountain city of Yekaterinburg, along with his wife, his 4 daughters, and his young son. The king wrote in his diary that he was horrified. What the diary does not explain, and what the black-bordered mourning notices in the London papers did not mention, is that 18 months earlier the king's own government had quietly withdrawn an offer of British asylum that might have brought the Romanov family to safety in England. The withdrawal came at the king's own urging, delivered through his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, who warned that sheltering a deposed autocrat could put the British throne itself at risk. Nicholas II and George V were cousins through their mothers, 2 Danish sisters who had married into the royal houses of Russia and Britain. The resemblance between the 2 men was close enough that photographs from a family wedding 5 years earlier showed 2 officers who could pass for brothers. One of those cousins kept his crown. The other did not survive to see his 50th birthday. The difference between them was not simply a matter of luck. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how the British monarchy survived 2 wars that erased the thrones of some of its closest relatives, it helps to look at what the House of Windsor actually was before it took that name. In 1914, the reigning British royal family was formerly the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a title inherited through Prince Albert, the German-born husband of Queen Victoria. The family tree of European royalty at the outbreak of the First World War was, in practice, one extended household. George V was a first cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, whose mother was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter. He was a first cousin of Tsar Nicholas II through his own mother, Queen Alexandra, and her sister, the Russian Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna. The 3 monarchs who would spend 4 years directing their nations to kill each other's soldiers had grown up attending the same family christenings. That closeness became a political liability the moment war began. German place names and German honors were stripped from British maps and medal cabinets by the autumn of 1914, and by 1917 the king's own surname had become a target. Zeppelin raids over London killed civilians under a flag that shared its royal house with the enemies. The writer H.G. Wells published an essay describing the British court as alien and uninspiring, and the king is said to have remarked to a friend that he might be uninspiring, but he would be damned if he was alien. Whether or not the king used those exact words, the sentiment behind them was real enough to prompt action. On the 17th of July 1917, George V issued a royal proclamation renouncing all German titles held by the family and adopting a new name for the house, Windsor, after the castle that had stood on the Thames for 800 years. Relatives followed his lead. Prince Louis of Battenberg, a German-born admiral who had risen to First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy before being forced to resign amid anti-German suspicion early in the war, anglicized his family name to Mountbatten. Cousins with names like Teck and Hesse quietly became Cambridge and simply stopped using the old titles in public. Not every relative made the same choice, and the one who chose differently shows exactly what was at stake. Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a grandson of Queen Victoria, born a British prince and raised partly at Windsor. He had inherited the German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha as a young man, and when war came he stayed loyal to Germany, serving as an honorary general in the German army, and losing his British titles under the same 1917 legislation that gave his cousin the name Windsor. 2 decades later he went further, joining the Nazi Party and rising within its paramilitary structure. He was arrested by American forces at the end of the Second World War, tried by a German denazification court, stripped of most of his remaining property, and died in 1954 in relative poverty in a small house in Coburg. He and George V had been raised in the same nursery generation, played with the same cousins at the same family gatherings, and inherited titles from the same grandmother. One of them adjusted his name and stayed a king. The other kept his name and lost everything attached to it. The scale of what was happening to the wider family becomes clear only when the losses are counted together. Nicholas II abdicated in March of 1917 after mutiny and revolution swept through Petrograd, and he and his family spent 16 months under increasingly close arrest, first at their own palace, then at a governor's mansion in Tobolsk, and finally in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg that the Bolshevik guards renamed the House of Special Purpose. In the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918, as White Russian forces approached the city, local Bolshevik officials had the entire family and 4 remaining members of their household taken to the cellar and shot. The bodies were burned, doused in acid, and buried in a forest clearing that was not properly identified for most of a century. It remains, among the fallen dynasties of that war, the most complete physical erasure of a ruling family that Europe saw in the 20th century. Kaiser Wilhelm II fared better only in the sense that he survived. He abdicated on the 9th of November 1918, 2 days before the armistice, and fled by train to the Netherlands, where Queen Wilhelmina granted him asylum, despite Article 227 of the Treaty of Versailles, which named him directly and called for his trial as a war criminal. He lived out the rest of his life at a modest estate called Huis Doorn, chopping wood and receiving a shrinking circle of monarchist visitors, and he was still there, an old man in exile, when German tanks crossed into the Netherlands in 1940. He died a year later, having outlived the empire he once ruled by more than 2 decades, but never again setting foot in Germany as anything but a private citizen. The Habsburgs, who had ruled Austria-Hungary for the better part of 6 centuries, lost even the illusion of continuity. Emperor Karl I withdrew from state affairs in November of 1918 under pressure from his own parliament, though he refused to use the word abdicate. He attempted twice, in 1921, to reclaim the Hungarian throne, both times without success, and was exiled by the Allied powers to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died of pneumonia the following year at the age of 34. The Habsburg law that followed banned his family from Austrian soil and required any member who wished to return to formally renounce their claim to the throne, a restriction that in various forms stayed on the books for most of the 20th century. Set beside these outcomes, George V's decision to rename his house looks almost trivial. It was not. A change of surname does not usually determine whether a family survives a world war with its throne intact. But the men who made that choice in 1917 understood something their cousins did not: that legitimacy built on bloodline alone was no longer enough, and that the family which looked most native to its own country would be the family still standing when the fighting stopped. George V spent the interwar years converting that survival into something more durable than relief. He toured industrial towns during economic depression, visited coal mines, and delivered the first royal Christmas broadcast on the radio in 1932, a 15-minute address written by Rudyard Kipling that reached homes across the Commonwealth. By the time of his Silver Jubilee in May of 1935, marking 25 years on the throne, the man who had once worried that his own name might sink his dynasty was met by crowds so large and so warm that he told his diary he had no idea people felt that way about him. He did not live much longer to enjoy it. By January of 1936, the king was seriously ill with the bronchial condition that had troubled him for years, and on the evening of the 20th, his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, made a decision that stayed hidden from the public for exactly 50 years. According to notes Dawson wrote at the time, and that were only published after his own death, he administered a final injection of morphine and cocaine, not primarily to ease the king's pain, but timed so that the death would be announced in the morning papers, rather than what Dawson's notes called the less appropriate evening press. George V died just before midnight. The nation learned of his death the way Dawson had arranged for it to learn, in the measured, dignified prose of a morning bulletin rather than a hurried evening special. It is a small, strange detail, and it says something true about the family that survived the war. Even the manner of a king's death was managed for how it would read the next morning. The king who inherited the throne that January was Edward VIII, and he lasted less than a year. The public reason was Wallis Simpson, an American who had already been divorced once and was in the process of a second divorce when the new king made clear he intended to marry her. As head of the Church of England, which did not at the time permit remarriage after divorce with a former spouse still living, Edward faced open opposition from the government of Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, from the Dominion governments, and from most of the church hierarchy. On the 11th of December 1936, after less than 11 months on the throne, he signed an instrument of abdication and broadcast a farewell address, describing himself as unable to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. He became, by royal creation, the Duke of Windsor, and left the country he had briefly ruled. The Simpson marriage was the reason given publicly, and it was a real one. It was not the only reason members of the government were relieved to see him go. Edward had shown, well before the abdication, an openness to fascist politics that alarmed people around him, and after he left the throne, that openness became harder to disguise. In October of 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor toured Nazi Germany as guests of the regime, met Hitler personally at his mountain retreat, and were photographed touring German labor and youth facilities with evident approval. A photograph from that visit shows the Duke raising his arm in what is unmistakably a Nazi salute. What happened 3 years later is the part of the story that stayed out of public view the longest. After the fall of France in the summer of 1940, the Windsors made their way through Spain to neutral Portugal, where they took up residence at the Lisbon estate of a Portuguese banker with connections to German intelligence. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop authorized an operation, run by the intelligence officer Walter Schellenberg, aimed at persuading, or if necessary, coercing, the Duke to remain on the European continent, rather than travel on to a British government posting. The plan, later referred to in captured German records as Operation Willy, explored the possibility that if Britain fell or sued for peace, the Duke of Windsor might be installed as a compliant monarch under German protection. Winston Churchill, who had by then replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister, learned enough of what was circulating in Lisbon to grow seriously alarmed. He ordered the Duke appointed governor of the Bahamas, a minor colonial post that had the practical effect of getting him onto a ship and out of Europe, and reportedly warned him through official channels that failure to comply could result in a court-martial. The documents describing all of this did not surface through any statement from the Duke or from the British royal household. They surfaced because American and British forces, sweeping through Germany at the end of the war, captured the entire archive of the German Foreign Office at a repository near the town of Marburg. Buried inside those crates of files, alongside the ordinary correspondence of a defeated bureaucracy, were the telegrams and internal memoranda describing German hopes for the Duke and the operation to keep him in reach. American historians, preparing the official documentary record of German foreign policy, wanted to publish the material as part of a broader academic series. The British government did not want it published at all, and when it became clear that publication could not be stopped outright, it fought for years over redactions, timing, and the wording of an introduction meant to frame the documents before anyone else could. The material became known inside official circles as the Windsor File, and successive British governments, under Churchill himself and later under Attlee and Eden, treated its contents as a problem to be managed rather than a record to be released. A version finally appeared in 1957, more than a decade after the war had ended, accompanied by British-authored commentary intended to contextualize it. Full, unredacted access to some of the underlying material was not granted for decades afterward. The Duke, who had been forced out for marrying a divorcee, spent the rest of his life a minor figure of post-war society, largely because the more serious reason for keeping him away from a throne sat in a closed file for a generation before anyone outside government was allowed to read it. None of this was public knowledge in 1936. What was public was a throne left empty by a king who had chosen love over duty, and a nervous second son standing in the wings who had never expected to wear the crown and dreaded the idea of doing it in public. His name was Albert, and when he became king that December he chose to reign as George VI, borrowing his father's name rather than his own, a small act of continuity meant to reassure a country that had just watched a monarch quit. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. George VI had a stammer so severe that a radio address in 1925, delivered at the closing of the British Empire exhibition, left him visibly and audibly struggling in front of a crowded stadium and a live broadcast audience. He had spent years working with an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logue, using breathing exercises and painstaking rehearsal to bring the stammer under enough control to function in public, and even after years of practice, every major broadcast remained an ordeal he prepared for, as though it were a physical test. On the 3rd of September 1939, hours after Britain declared war on Germany, it was this king, not his more naturally charismatic older brother, who had to deliver the broadcast, informing the country that it was at war again, 21 years after the last one had supposedly ended all wars. He got through it. Listeners who had heard him struggle through the 1925 broadcast noticed the difference, and many wrote to tell him so. The war tested the family in ways that speeches alone could not measure. Buckingham Palace was hit by German bombs on several occasions during the Blitz, most seriously on the 13th of September 1940, when a German aircraft dropped a stick of bombs directly onto the palace grounds while the king and queen were in residence, destroying the royal chapel and shattering windows only yards from where the couple had been standing minutes earlier. Rather than treat the attack as a reason to leave London, the Queen, born Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, used it in public remarks to draw the royal family closer to the ordinary people whose homes were being destroyed across the east end of the city, saying in substance that she was glad the palace had been hit, because now she felt she could look the bombed districts of London in the face. Government officials had drawn up plans to evacuate the young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, to Canada for the duration of the war, the way other prominent British families were sending their children across the Atlantic. The Queen reportedly refused, on the grounds that the children would not leave without her, she would not leave without the king, and the king would not leave the country under any circumstances. The princesses spent most of the war at Windsor Castle, a short drive from London, close enough that the family gathered together whenever the king's schedule allowed it. The elder princess did more than wait out the war behind castle walls. In 1945, at 18 years old, and against some resistance from courtiers who thought it inappropriate, Princess Elizabeth was permitted to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army, training as a driver and mechanic. She learned to strip an engine, change a tire, and drive a heavy transport vehicle, one of the only female members of the extended European royal families of her generation to do genuinely manual military work rather than hold a ceremonial post. Photographs from that year show a future queen in overalls, hands black with engine grease, looking entirely unlike the porcelain image of monarchy that had defined the family a generation earlier. It was a small gesture in the scale of a war that killed tens of millions of people, but it mattered enormously to how the British public came to see the family that would rule them for the rest of the century. They were not hiding from the war behind German cousins and inherited titles. They were staying in the bombed capital, working on trucks, and getting photographed doing it. On the 8th of May 1945, when victory in Europe was declared, the king, the queen, and the two princesses appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to a crowd that filled the mall from the palace gates to Admiralty Arch, and by special arrangement Elizabeth and Margaret were allowed to slip out into the anonymous crowd below, unrecognized, to celebrate among the people whose war their family had shared. The moment became one of the most quoted memories of Elizabeth's own reign decades later, and it stood in deliberate contrast to what had happened to other European royal households that same week, several of whom had spent the war negotiating with the armies occupying them rather than sharing danger with their citizens. Not every European monarchy handled the war the way the Windsors did, and the ones that handled it differently mostly did not survive it. King Leopold III of Belgium chose to remain in his country when German forces invaded in May of 1940 and, without consulting his own government, ordered the Belgian army to surrender 18 days later. He spent the rest of the war under German house arrest at his palace outside Brussels, a decision that looked to many Belgians like accommodation with the enemy rather than resistance to it, whatever his private intentions had been. When the war ended, the controversy over his conduct was severe enough that he was barred from returning to Belgium for years, and even after a referendum narrowly supported his return in 1950, continued unrest forced him to abdicate in favor of his son the following year. He had kept his life. He did not keep his throne, and the manner of his wartime choice is still debated in Belgium today. King Haakon VII of Norway made the opposite choice under nearly identical pressure. When Germany invaded Norway in April of 1940, Haakon refused an ultimatum to accept a German-installed government, escaped north through occupied territory under bombardment, and eventually reached Britain, where he spent the rest of the war broadcasting to occupied Norway and serving as the recognized head of a government in exile. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands did much the same thing days earlier, fleeing to London as German paratroopers landed near her palace and running a government in exile for 5 years rather than negotiate with an occupying power. Both monarchs returned home in 1945 as symbols of national resistance rather than figures of suspicion, and both monarchies survived the war with their standing intact, if not strengthened by the experience of exile and open defiance. The monarchies that vanished after 1945 mostly went for reasons that had little to do with wartime conduct at all. Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, whose long reign included the decision to appoint Mussolini as prime minister in 1922, abdicated in favor of his son just weeks before a national referendum in June of 1946, hoping to save the dynasty by distancing it from fascism. It did not work. Italians voted to abolish the monarchy outright. His son Umberto II reigned for only about a month before going into exile, and the male line of the House of Savoy remained formally banned from Italian soil until the year 2002. Romania's King Michael I was forced to sign an abdication document at gunpoint by the country's new Soviet-backed government in December of 1947. Bulgaria abolished its monarchy the previous year after a Soviet-supervised referendum, and Yugoslavia's monarchy was dissolved by Marshal Tito's communist government in 1945 without even the formality of a vote. None of those thrones fell because a king made the wrong wartime choice the way Leopold did. They fell because the political map of post-war Europe, redrawn under Soviet influence east of a certain line, had no room left for crowns at all. The war left its mark on the King of England, as much as on the country he had led through it. George VI had never wanted the throne, had taken it only because his brother chose a wedding ring over a crown, and had spent 6 years of the hardest fighting Europe had ever seen, chain-smoking through state papers and public appearances he found nearly unbearable because of the stammer he never fully lost. He developed lung cancer, worsened by decades of cigarettes, and by early 1952 he was gravely ill, though the severity was kept from most of the public. On the 5th of February that year, he spent what would be his last full day alive shooting hares on the grounds of Sandringham, apparently in reasonable spirits. He died in his sleep that night, found by a servant the next morning, at the age of 56. His elder daughter, the same young woman who had trained as an army mechanic 7 years earlier, was in Kenya at the time, partway through a Commonwealth tour standing in for her father, when the news reached her at a small lodge called Treetops. She flew home a queen, 25 years old, having left Britain as a princess, and landed as a monarch without ever having planned for the throne to come to her quite so soon. The abdication that had put her father on the throne 16 years earlier, and the war that had defined his entire reign, meant that Elizabeth II inherited a crown that had already been tested by exactly the kind of crisis that had ended so many other European monarchies. She had watched, as a child, what those tests looked like up close. She had seen her own home bombed. She had watched her father learn, broadcast by broadcast, how to sound like a king, despite a voice that fought him the entire time. When her own reign began, it began on a foundation her parents and grandfather had spent 35 years building, one careful decision at a time, out of a family name that had once seemed dangerous enough to abandon. Set against that map of vanished thrones, the survival of the House of Windsor looks less like an accident of geography and more like the accumulated result of decisions made across 3 decades by people who understood exactly how fragile a crown had become. A family that changed its name in 1917 rather than risk being mistaken for the enemy. A king who let his own wealthiest German cousin go rather than let that cousin's sympathies become the family's liability. A government that kept a captured wartime archives worth of paperwork sealed for over a decade because the alternative was letting the country ask hard questions about how close a former king's brother had come to being useful to Adolf Hitler. A queen who stayed inside a bombed palace and told the country she was glad of it. A future monarch who spent part of a world war with Greece on her hands rather than an ocean between herself and the fighting. None of that guaranteed anything. Crowns fell across Europe for reasons that had nothing to do with character, and there is no version of this story where careful choices alone explain why one family kept its palace, while cousins lost their lives, their countries, or both. But the pattern is there in the record for anyone willing to look at the difference between the families that vanished and the one that did not. The Romanovs were shot in a cellar and buried in an unmarked forest grave that stayed unidentified for most of a century. The Hohenzollerns chopped wood on a borrowed Dutch estate and watched, from exile, as the country they once ruled invaded the country that was sheltering them. The Habsburgs were legislated out of existence by the Parliament of the Empire they had governed for 600 years. The House of Windsor changed its name, buried its most dangerous secret in a file it fought for a generation to keep closed, and put its future queen behind the wheel of an army truck in the middle of the worst war in human history. Somewhere in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle today, in the round tower that has stood on that site since the 12th century, sit boxes of correspondence from those exact years that remain closed to researchers, some of them concerning the Duke of Windsor specifically, released only in carefully chosen fragments over the decades since his death in 1972. The name Windsor is still the family's name, chosen in a moment of wartime panic more than a century ago and never changed back. The cellar in Yekaterinburg, where George V's cousin died, is now the site of a cathedral built to mark it. The two men who once looked so alike in a photograph that friends could not tell them apart ended up, 100 years later, remembered in almost opposite ways, one as a murdered former ruler, the other as the root of a line still sitting, however differently than before, in a castle that bears a borrowed name for a family that decided very deliberately, at exactly the right moments, what it was willing to give up in order to keep it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.